The shriek of Eleanor Karen Price cut through the morning air like a hot knife. Her prized Porsche 911, once gleaming in the sun, was now a jigsaw puzzle of luxury parts, wheels, mirrors, and the windshield neatly stacked on my curb. She raged, but I just stood there, sipping my coffee casually, saying, "Morning, Eleanor. Looks like your parking privileges expired." But how did it come to this? From her blocking my driveway every morning to me methodically dismantling her Porsche without breaking a single law. The twist. She didn't know it yet, but I was about to teach her the hardest lesson of all. Eleanor Karen Price was the embodiment of suburban power, the kind that makes you cringe even before she opens her mouth. The first time I saw her, she was stepping out of her black Porsche 911 like she'd just arrived from a boardroom, not a sleepy cul-de-sac. The oversized sunglasses, the heels too high for a quiet neighborhood, and that blazer stiff as if it could deflect bullets made it clear she wasn't here to just live, she was here to reign. And she had one mission: to make everyone else bow to her. As the newly elected HOA president, Eleanor didn't just want control, she craved it. Every rule was a tool, every fine a weapon, and every homeowner a potential target for her relentless need to prove she was untouchable. To her, power wasn't about working with the community, it was about dominating it. The moment I crossed her radar, it became personal. First, it was the Chevy truck I was restoring too unsightly for her taste. Then my recycling bin, my lawn, my shutters. Nothing escaped her judgment. She didn't care about what was right, she cared about what she could control. And if you crossed her like parking too close to her precious driveway, you were marked. But she made a grave mistake when she decided to target me. Because this quiet old man, he wasn't going to roll over. I moved into Oak Ridge Estates over 20 years ago with Marlene, my late wife. It wasn't just a house, it was our home, our dream. We'd chosen it because of the oak trees that arched over the street like old friends holding hands. The mornings were quiet, the birds were always arguing over breakfast, and life was simple. Marlene loved how the neighborhood felt untouched, serene, with no pretensions. And me, I loved how it felt to come home after a long day, to walk through that front door and know that the world could wait. I maintained everything as she left it after she passed. The roses she planted beside the mailbox, I pruned them every spring. The bird bath she found at a flea market, still there, standing proudly in the same sunny corner of the yard. And that driveway, the one we spent weekends perfecting with those stone pavers instead of asphalt, I kept it sacred. The last project we did together. But when someone disrespected that space, it didn't sit right with me. And Eleanor, well, she'd just made a mistake. For most of the 2 decades I'd lived here, the HOA was a harmless group of retired folks who just wanted to keep things nice. But when they elected Eleanor, that's when things started to shift. At first, I didn't think much of her. She was the typical newcomer with a shiny new title and an inflated sense of self-importance. But I noticed something. She wasn't like the others. The first time I saw her stepping out of her black Porsche dressed like she was heading to a Fortune 500 meeting instead of a community gathering, I realized this wasn't just about bylaws for her. She was playing a different game. And when her eyes landed on me, I knew it was only a matter of time before my peaceful routine was upended. I had no idea that my quiet life, my memories, would soon be threatened by her hunger for control. It started subtly at first, like a soft drip of water that eventually wears down the stone. The first letter was a joke. I had been working on a vintage Chevy truck in my garage, a project I'd promised Marlene I'd finish one day. It wasn't blocking anything. The truck was half in and half out, just enough to give me room to maneuver. But that didn't matter to Eleanor. I found a thin white envelope taped to my door one afternoon, the words HOA violation. Notice glaring at me like a badge of shame. Rule 14B, it said, prohibiting unsightly automotive work visible from the street. Unsightly. My truck was pristine, every inch of it had been carefully restored. But Eleanor didn't care. To her, it wasn't about the truck. It was about control. A power move disguised as a rule. I brushed it off as a first strike, thinking maybe it was just a formality. I was wrong. More letters followed. A warning about my recycling bin, apparently it was visible from the street at an angle I hadn't noticed. A note demanding I repaint my shutters because they'd faded by 6%. A warning about the grass in my front yard not being uniformly trimmed. All minor things, all ridiculous, but each one a reminder that Eleanor was watching, waiting for an opportunity to assert her authority. I stayed polite, of course. I'm not the kind of guy to raise a fuss over every little thing. But then she crossed a line, an unwritten one that only a man who has lived in his house for as long as I have could understand. One Tuesday morning, in late August, I stepped outside with my coffee, the sunlight barely cresting over the horizon, bathing everything in that soft golden light that makes everything seem calm. But as I walked to my truck, I saw Eleanor's black Porsche parked directly in front of my driveway. Not just near it, but practically blocking it. I couldn't back out without doing a three-point turn worthy of a stunt driver. And the worst part, her own driveway was empty. Her curb was wide open. She had parked there on purpose. I stood there staring at the Porsche, wondering if she had a delivery coming or if something had gone wrong. But no, it was intentional. I could feel it in my gut. She was trying to make a statement. I walked across the street and knocked on her door. When she opened it, her sunglasses perched on her nose, smoothie in hand, she looked at me like I was interrupting something incredibly important. "Morning," I said calmly. "I think you've parked a little too close to my driveway. Would you mind moving it back a few feet?" She blinked unfazed. "That's common area parking," she said dismissively. "Perfectly legal." "I'm not saying it's illegal," I replied. "I'm saying it's blocking my driveway." She shrugged and shut the door in my face. No apology, no acknowledgement of the inconvenience, just a cold, deliberate dismissal. I stood there for a moment, my coffee still in hand, the neighborhood waking up around me, and I felt something click in my chest. A cold, precise clarity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was a power move. Eleanor wanted to show me that she could inconvenience me at will, that I was just another homeowner she could boss around. And she didn't care about the rules. Not really. The next day, I went out and found the Porsche in the same spot. The day after that, same thing. On day 3, I knocked again, this time feeling a little less hopeful. This time she didn't even open the door. Her voice came through the intercom, dismissive and smug. "It's legal parking, Marcus. Don't bother me with this again." I stood there, my jaw tight, realizing something I hadn't quite processed yet. This wasn't about parking. This was about dominance. Eleanor wasn't just inconveniencing me. She was making a point. And what's worse, I was the only one who seemed to care. I couldn't let it slide. This wasn't just about my driveway. This was about respect. Respect for my home, for my memories, for the space I had worked so hard to maintain. That's when I decided. I wasn't going to fight Eleanor with anger or with shouting. I was going to fight her with what I know best: patience, precision, and the law. I started documenting everything: photographs, timestamps, the daily ritual of her car parked just a little too close. I filed it all away, every photo, every video, every note. But it wasn't enough just to document it. I needed a strategy. And that's when I remembered the advice I had heard from one of my old friends. If you want to win, play the game better than they do. And Eleanor, she was playing checkers. But I was about to teach her how to play chess. The next move, I called the police. Not to get her ticketed, no, that wouldn't work. I called them to get a record of the situation. To make sure when the time came I had all the evidence I needed. It was time to escalate things. But little did Eleanor know I was already several steps ahead. The morning after I called the police, Eleanor's Porsche was sitting in front of my driveway again, just a hair's breadth away from blocking my access. It was a predictable pattern now, as reliable as the sunrise. But something was different this time. This time, I was ready. I didn't react with anger. I didn't march over to her door. Instead, I did what I had been doing for weeks. I documented everything. I snapped another set of photos, wide shots, to show the street layout close-ups, to capture the exact distance to my driveway. Even a time-stamped video of me maneuvering my truck around her, Porsche inching dangerously close to her. Bumper. By now I had a folder full of evidence. Every photo, every video, every note I had made, all neatly organized in a blue binder I carried everywhere. Eleanor had underestimated me. She thought this was just a petty dispute over parking spaces. She didn't know I was building a case that would be undeniable, a case that would expose her for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind HOA rules to push people around. So I did something she didn't expect. I called the police again. Not to get her arrested, but to get an official record of the situation. I knew she'd try to pull the same stunt as last time, pretending she didn't understand the inconvenience. But this time I was going to be ready for whatever she threw at me. When the officers arrived, they seemed genuinely confused by the situation, just as I had hoped. The young officer who'd been polite last time stepped out of his car, his eyes scanning the street. "You called again," he asked, looking from me to Eleanor's car parked too close to my driveway. "I'm just trying to get out of my own house," I said, keeping my voice even. "Every morning it's the same thing. It's obstructing my access." The female officer raised an eyebrow, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She had been there before, and I could tell she was starting to understand the bigger picture. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning to Eleanor, "can you explain why you're parking so close to his driveway?" Eleanor didn't miss a beat. She flipped her hair, put on that sugary smile, and said, "Oh, officer, I wasn't aware I was causing any trouble. I just thought this spot was common parking. It's a misunderstanding." But the officer wasn't buying it. She glanced at me, then back at Eleanor. "We've been here before," she said coolly. "You've been warned. This isn't just about a simple parking violation. This is about obstruction, and it's becoming a civil matter." Eleanor froze her smile, faltering for a split second before she quickly regained her composure. She tried to argue, but the officers were already turning away from her, starting to walk back toward their cruiser. "Ma'am," the female officer said, "you've been warned. If this continues, we'll need to take further action. And next time, it might not be just a warning." Eleanor's face turned bright red, the reality of her defeat sinking in. I could see the moment when she realized she'd pushed too far. The officers drove off, leaving her standing there, seething in her defeat. But that wasn't the end of it. No, this was where it all started to unravel for her. I knew I had to escalate things further, but it wasn't going to be a shouting match. It was going to be a legal fight, a game of strategy. And this time, Eleanor was about to find out that I was a much better player than she'd ever anticipated. I spent the next few days preparing, gathering every scrap of evidence I had. I knew this wasn't just about parking. This was about her weaponizing the HOA to manipulate and control people. It was time to take the gloves off. And so I called the HOA board meeting. Eleanor had made the mistake of underestimating me, of thinking she could bully me into submission. Now I was going to bring the full force of the law into play, and I was going to do it the right way. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. As I walked into the clubhouse, I could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just a regular meeting anymore, it had become something bigger. Eleanor had already arrived, papers in hand, standing at the front like a general preparing for battle. She flashed a tight smile when she saw me, but there was a flicker of unease behind her eyes. She knew what was coming. As soon as I took my seat, she stood up and addressed the room, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Let's talk about the ongoing issues at the Jones residence, shall we?" Her eyes were locked on me as she presented a stack of complaints. Parking violations unsightly, trucks in the driveway, and even issues with his recycling bin being visible. She looked around the room, waiting for the others to nod in agreement. But this time, the room was different. They could feel the shift in the air. I didn't interrupt. I just sat there, calm, quiet, watching. It was her turn to speak, and mine was coming. She finished her list of fabricated complaints and sat down, waiting for the board to take her side. She was still convinced that her position gave her the power to manipulate the entire neighborhood. But that was about to change. I stood up, slowly walked to the front, and placed my blue binder on the table. I could feel all eyes on me. I didn't have to say anything right away. I just opened it, pulled out the certified mail receipt, and handed it to the board members. Then I placed the photos on the table one by one. Time-stamped pictures of her Porsche parked too close to my driveway. Videos showing how I had to maneuver my truck just to leave my house. And then came the kicker, the legal documents, the statutes, the city ordinances. I laid them out like a blueprint for the truth. "You see, Eleanor," I said, turning to her, "I've been documenting everything just like you've been making your moves. But unlike you, I didn't break any rules. I just followed them better than you did. Everything I've done is documented. Everything's legal." The room went silent as the board members flipped through the evidence. Eleanor's face was turning a deep shade of red as she tried to make excuses, but she knew she had been caught. She was cornered and there was no way out. The truth was undeniable, and the board knew it. Mr. Patterson, the quiet neighbor who'd been watching from the sidelines, was the first to speak up. "I've seen that Porsche parked there every morning," he said. "This has gone too far." The tension in the room reached its peak when one of the board members who had been on the fence about supporting Eleanor finally spoke up. "This isn't about parking anymore. It's about bullying, and we can't let that continue." The board voted unanimously to remove Eleanor from her position as HOA president. She was forced to issue a public apology to me, and the fines she had imposed on me for my violations were officially overturned. The neighborhood, once held hostage by her power plays, could finally breathe again. Eleanor didn't take it well. As the meeting wrapped up, she shot me one last glare, her voice low and venomous. "This isn't over," she hissed. But I wasn't worried. I knew she had no power anymore. Her empire had crumbled, and all that was left was the shattered image of a woman who had lost everything: her position, her respect, and her Porsche. The next few days were surreal. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, began to return to normal. Neighbors waved at each other again, kids played in the streets without fear of fines, and the lawns were finally peaceful. But for me, the real reward came in the form of quiet mornings, with coffee in hand, watching the sunrise as my wife's roses bloomed once more. And just when I thought the drama had ended, the final twist of fate arrived. 3 days later, a flatbed tow truck pulled up in front of Eleanor's house. The same towing company that had hauled away her Porsche in pieces was back. The driver hopped out and nodded at me. "Morning, Mr. Jones?" Guess what? She didn't pay for the reassembly bill. "Round two?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. The driver grinned. "Yep. She sent the car to the dealership, had it put back together, and then refused to pay. Now they've filed a mechanic's lien, and I'm here to take it. As I watched Eleanor's prized Porsche freshly reassembled and gleaming disappear down the street on the flatbed, I couldn't help but laugh. Not loudly, not obnoxiously, just the quiet laugh of a man who knew karma had found its way back to her doorstep. Eleanor watched from her window, her face tight with fury, but this time she didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She didn't do anything. She just stood there silent as her past mistakes were driven away. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in her yard, and it wasn't long before new buyers moved in. They were friendly, offering to help with gardening, asking for neighborhood tips, and for the first time in a long while I felt peace settle in the air. Eleanor's reign was over, and with it the neighborhood finally returned to the way it should have been all along. The air felt lighter, the birds sounded louder, and as for me, well, I knew one thing for certain: sometimes the good guys do win.